Welcome back to the Great Hylian Debate, where I take on somebody with an awful opinion and we verbally fight it out to decide who's right and who's wrong. And that, of course, will be decided by you. Before we get into the second episode, I'll announce the winner from the first one, in which Tyler Townsend and I clashed at first over whether Ocarina of Time is an overrated game, though the conversation kinda just turned into Ocarina of Time vs Twilight Princess. I ended the video with a prompt for people to say either Nehru won or Tyler won to vote, and by that metric, I won by a single vote. However, if we include the people who picked an argument but didn't specifically mention a name, it becomes a tie. I'll have to have him back on for a rematch because that was close. Turning attention to today's episode, a quick reminder of the format. Traditionally, the person making the assertion will go first. But since there isn't really a primary assertion we're arguing over today, I'll just allow my guest to go first. I will then have an opportunity to respond, countering points and raising new ones as needed. Then it will go back to the original person. By the end, everybody will have had equal amount of time to speak, up to a maximum of 3 rounds. Then we bequeath it to you, the audience, to decide who's right and who's wrong. And as for today's topic, simple. What's the best Zelda game on the GameCube? Is it Twilight Princess? Is it Wind Waker? Is it Four Swords Adventures? For the second episode in a row, I gotta be opposite Twilight Princess again. I swear I don't actually hate it or anything, as I die fighting for my favorite Zelda game of all time. I'm pleased to debate Triforce Trends, who's an up-and-coming Zeldatuber who, at this point, is a stone throw away from hitting 200 subscribers. He's a well-worded guy, though it's a shame his words will fail him when he goes up against me. Tell us about yourself, Triforce Trends, and then lay out your argument.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well, and thanks to Nehru for having me on the channel today. As previously established, my name is Triforce Trends. I recently started up my channel as I love to talk about anything Zelda and just general Nintendo related. As he did with Tyler in the last Hylian debate, Nehru asked me what the hottest take I have on the Zelda series is, and I had to throw out the fact that Twilight Princess is easily one of the best Zelda games, if not the best, and absolutely the best on the GameCube. While Nehru is arguing by the side that Wind Waker is the best Zelda game on the GameCube. Not a very wise thing to say. Before I begin with my points, let me address that I think that the Wind Waker is still an amazing game. It is in fact still one of my favourite Zelda games. I just have some major gripes with it. Let's get it started. I'm gonna get straight into my first point of this video, and the most glaring piece of evidence for Twilight Princess being a far superior game to Wind Waker. So let's talk about the dungeons. Come on Nehru, you can't tell me that the dungeons in Wind Waker come even close to the grand monuments that Twilight Princess takes you into. Even the game's most underwhelming dungeon is better than the average dungeon in Wind Waker. Let me go into the specifics. In my opinion, the best dungeon in Twilight Princess is the Arbiter's Grounds, as the lore behind the dungeon that once held Ganon is extremely interesting. And even the quest of getting into the grounds is an interesting one, with your penultimate encounter with the King of Moblins, King Bulblin, which in itself is already an amazing mini-boss to gain entrance into the dungeon. Now let me compare this to dungeons in general in Wind Waker. A glaring problem here would be the clear lack of time that the Zelda team actually had to make this game. I'll go more into filler quests later, but Nehru, 2 of the dungeons from Wind Waker were cut out due to development times, and then cleverly designed to fit the style of Twilight Princess, the clearly better Zelda game. I mean, even the number of dungeons is lackluster. 7 dungeons, and that's counting both Ganon's Tower and the Forsaken Fortress. I would be very tempted to drop it down to 5 dungeons. Now let's take a look at the number of Twilight Princess dungeons. 9 whole dungeons. Now I'll be fair and take Hyrule Castle out of the Twilight Princess dungeons, as I did with Ganon's Tower in Wind Waker. That still comes to a total of 8 whole dungeons, fitted with their own aesthetic on each, and no tedious command melodies to control Medley and Makar. I can deal with command melodies on the statues as they aren't used too much, but all credit where credit is due. The first half of Wind Waker, up until about the Tower of Gods, is certainly bearable, and I think that if the second portion was as hard hitting, that the conversation would be much different right now. I'll be back on my own channel talking about how Wind Waker is amazing, but unfortunately that's exactly what didn't happen. Instead, Nehru, I'm going to mention a quest that I guarantee you didn't want me to bring up. The Triforce Shard collecting quest. I mean, let's get real, man. This should not be in the last portion of a game. The frustration that runs through you when you realise on your first playthrough that you have to pick up 9 whole Triforce Shards, and that each one is fairly boring to venture around the world for, except maybe one, being the Triforce Shard that hides in the ghost ship. Aonuma actually stated that he was disappointed with the overall flow of the original GameCube game, and wants to improve the tempo of the game in the HD remake that came out on the Wii U back in 2013. And even that in some ways failed to reach the expectation that I think Aonuma had. I'm sorry man, but Wind Waker has to die on the hill when it comes to dungeons, especially when compared to such a game as Twilight Princess. I mean, Twilight Princess had such an amazing selection, whereas Wind Waker could have had a good selection, but ends up having a small selection with good ones being hard to find. If you think that the dungeons are even close, then nay, Ruto will be disappointed in you thinking that a game without Zoras could even compare to a game with the Zoras playing such a large role.
Oh man, I bet you were just giddy when you started writing your scathing critique of the dungeons in the Triforce quest. Unfortunately for you, Trends, if I can call you Trends, I'm prepared. Coming at me with dungeon and Triforce chart critique is like coming at Ocarina of Time fans with complaints about Naga. We've heard it all before. First, the Triforce chart quest. Yeah, it's an objectively terrible quest, I won't deny that. But it's downright foolish of you to bring up tedious scavenger hunts as a detraction. If this were simply a debate about Wind Waker's quality, then I might have to concede. But it isn't. It's a comparison between Twilight Princess and Wind Waker. And Twilight Princess contains a fetch quest just as, if not more, egregious than the Triforce chart quest. And what makes it worse is in Twilight Princess, you have to do this quest over and over and over again. I am, of course, talking about the shadow insect hunting Tears of Light quests that you go on every time you enter a new area. There's a lot of criticism to be made of the Wolf Link portions in general, and trust me, I'll get into it. But for now, let's talk about how awful the bug hunting quests are. 16 bugs. You have to hunt 16 bugs every damn time. You have to run around and hunt these little bugs, largely blind, with nothing but some basic single button platforming and the occasional fight to keep you entertained. Since fighting as Wolf Link is basic to the point of being a nuisance, it serves to only lengthen these miserable portions. The areas surely look interesting in a layer of Twilight, and it is fun seeing the differences in townfolk between Twilight versus not. But surely this could have still been experienced via a less monotonous quest? The Triforce chart quest sucks, but a couple hours and it's out of your life. The Tears of Light quests happen over and over and over again, and I'm not the only one who feels this way. Even reviews that give the game top scores cite this as an annoyance. And considering Nintendo lowered the amount of tiers to collect for the HD remake, they seem to agree too. So it looks like Twilight Princess and Wind Waker both have terrible scavenger hunt quests, though at least with Triforce charts you're doing marginally unique tasks instead of the same thing over and over. And onto dungeons, which I know is your true ace in the sleeve, your real gotcha moment. And I gotta say, you're right. Wind Waker temples are largely underwhelming from a mechanical perspective, I concede that point. But I want to argue broadly and narrowly that this doesn't really exclude it from being best GameCube Zelda material. On a whole, I don't agree with the notion that a Zelda game needs incredible 10 out of 10 dungeons to be excellent. Stating the blatantly obvious, Breath of the Wild's dungeons are huge disappointments. I'm sure some people will push back on that, but most Zelda fans agree that the Divine Beasts were classic examples of cool concepts executed poorly. Yet Breath of the Wild is considered a masterpiece, rightfully so. Majora's Mask as well. Though Woodfall and Icona are both good, Great Bay and Snowhead are both fairly bad, simple dungeons. And since Majora's Mask only has 4 primary dungeons, that means half the dungeons in the game are not great. And yet Majora's Mask is widely cited as the favorite for a huge percentage of Zelda fans. On the other hand, Skyward Sword has pretty excellent dungeons, with the Ancient Cistern in particular appearing on a huge amount of people's top 5 or 10 dungeons. Yet Skyward Sword is actively disliked by a lot of Zelda fans despite these excellent dungeons because of motion controls and what they wrongly perceive as a bad story. There is so much more to Zelda than just the dungeon crawling, and trying to tie a game's overall quality to the mechanical difficulty of its dungeons is poor form. A Zelda game with bad dungeons can excel in so many other areas. Lastly, considering the dungeon count of a Zelda game when considering its quality is pretty silly. Majora's Mask has 4 dungeons, Minish Cap has 6, and I'll let you be the one to tell those rabid fan bases that their game of choice is of lesser quality because of it. Less dungeons can mean a more tightly crafted experience, which is something Twilight Princess could use more of. I agree that Twilight Princess at its best has some of the best dungeons in the series, but honestly, the at its best pretty much just results in the Snow Peak Ruins and Arbiter Grounds. 9 temples, sure, but Twilight Princess also holds the record for blandest water and fire temple in a 3D Zelda game, and the Temple of Time, while looking cool, is a tedious bore. I'll take a simple Wind Waker temple over slogs like the Temple of Time and the Palace of Twilight any day. Truthfully, I have a lot more to say in defense of Wind Waker's temples, and I look forward to mounting my critique of Twilight Princess's mechanics, but I think it's best to let you talk before I accidentally write a book.
As you're respectable in the fact that you conceded some of my points, I guess it'd only be right to do the same for you. I might have to agree with your point discussing the Tears of Light quest that plagues Twilight Princess, but I happen to think, at least with Eldin's Tears of Light, that in certain areas the Tears of Light quest can delve deeper into the story. I use Eldin as my evidence, as when approaching the Goron Mines as Wolfling, a colossal molten rock forced by the volcano lands in your path. This would eventually be used to save the Zora from an eternal freeze. Another side point of Eldin is when the shed housing all of Kakariko's bombs are blown to smithereens by the fire that Link begins, meaning that the hero can't buy bombs at that time in the game. And the most important chunk of story given in this segment, Wolf Link venturing into the house where all of the Odonian children lay in wait of either a hero or death. This small cutscene shows the player that the potential death if they're found is very, very real, showing that this is a very dark Zelda game compared to your average. And I also somewhat see your point when discussing the dungeons not being an integral part of some Zelda games, but I think that we can both agree that in the open world sense, when comparing these two games, they both offer very little. Maybe aside from some small side quests in both games. But in many ways they're both barren in their own ways, with a lot of Wind Waker's open world being locked behind the ceiling that can take 5 minutes at a time. But I can't defend Twilight Princess in this point either, as it clearly lacks a true great world to explore. It also locks you behind the use of your horse or taking a long walk through Hyrule Field. Now here is where I have to begin disagreeing, as both of these games have lackluster open worlds with few notable side quests, whereas I don't think you can compare these two games with the likes of Breath of the Wild and Majora's Mask. As Breath of the Wild's new thing was its emphasis on its huge open world, how beautiful it is, how many different things can be found such as shrines and Korok seeds, leaving you with a chunky game that takes many hours to 100%, even with extremely lackluster dungeons. Even Majora's Mask had exceptionally uninspired dungeons, that I cannot disagree with, but the game had the best side quests in the series spread out through its open world, and the easiest point to make, these two games were out to innovate on the formula. Breath of the Wild changed up the open world and progression, whereas Majora's Mask added the time mechanic, that I'll admit most fans of the series have mixed opinions of. So I think comparing these two games to Wind Waker and Twilight Princess is a preposterous idea. Now I'd like to quickly touch on your comment on the Twilight Princess dungeons housing both the blandest water and fire temples. Now I wish I could agree with this, but I've seen a majority of people hail the Goron Mines as one of their favourite fire temples in any Zelda game. And even on one of my Instagram posts, I've had a good few people state that they believe it's the best water temple in the series, with many saying that the design is so clever that newer players find it frustrating. Personally speaking, I'd like to state that I did not like the Goron Mines as much as a lot of people, but I did enjoy the change of pace by adding the magnetic mechanic present in the dungeon, and it made for some really cool moments actually. Not to mention it's where Link first acquires the Hero's Bow in the era of Twilight. When talking about Lakebed Temple, I wish I could call it bland, but the design is cleverly crafted and proves to be a challenge, but not an unfair challenge seen in the likes of the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time and the Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask. Not to mention a unique mini-boss. The less said about the boss, the better. Now we're at risk of making this entire video about the dungeons though, so let me give you one more point that may sway your opinion to the side slightly. And I'm certain that you would have seen this coming just as you did the dungeons in Triforce Fetch quest. I would expect from somebody who has a PFP of someone from the Oracle games. Now here's a spoiler warning for anyone who's not played these two games. The story. Now before I begin, let me say that both of these games have a great story in comparison to some in the Zelda series. In fact, Wind Waker and Twilight Princess have a very similar story in some ways, yet I find some issues that I have with Wind Waker's story, and I'm sure you do with Twilight Princess's. First, it's extremely clear from the start of Wind Waker that Tetra will somehow be linked to Zelda or the Triforce of Wisdom. The foreshadowing sat right there in the first lick of story you get your hands on. Tetra falls onto this tree in Outset Island, and so our story begins. The foreshadowing I mentioned is given when Link is set to saving Tetra. I'm sure many people can figure it out with just that, but even Tetra's appearance is reminiscent of Zelda in a cartoon fashion. I compliment the Zelda team for trying something new with the story in Wind Waker, as this was the first time we'd had a big twist like this since Days of Ocarina of Time, as Ganondorf was given freedom by the Hero of Time pulling the Master Sword. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a great twist, and there are some other great story elements, such as the King of Red Lions being the original King of Hyrule, and also Ganondorf's motives of bringing Hyrule back to its former glory. Not to mention that laugh, as his life's work is all torn down. However, it's clear that the developers enjoy creating a story with this formula, and they did it again, but improved on it, by adding a whole new race that are mysterious for the first half of the game, the Twilight. This would include Midna, who happens to be objectively the best companion in a Zelda game to date, and a range of new enemies, and perhaps more importantly to this argument, Zant, the Usurper King, the secondary antagonist to Ganondorf. Actually, let's talk about that. The player is tricked into thinking that maybe Zant will finally be a new primary antagonist, but through subtle hints throughout the game, the average player will in fact figure out that Ganondorf is Zant's puppet master. He's pulling the strings behind the scenes. I feel like I've gone on for way too long, and as you said, I wouldn't want to write a book before you even get a word in. If you made a trilogy of your arguments, it'd still come out even worse than the Twilight books, furthering the fact that Twilight Princess is better.
Worse than the Twilight books. Wind Waker is basically the Hobbit novel, and Twilight Princess is the bloated 3-film trilogy. I'm going to use your counterpoint to my Tears of Light complaint as a platform for wider critique. Yes, you're right, there were some cool moments as Wolf Link during the Tears of Light quests, but tying those cool moments to an awful scavenger hunt quest is a huge missed opportunity. Wolf Link on the whole is a massive missed opportunity. There are a scant handful of actually well done Wolf Link segments. The sewer dungeon was wonderful, sneaking into Orden Village was a hoot, the rush to get help for an injured Midna was a beautiful scene. But scenes like that constitute maybe 15% of your time as Wolf Link. The rest of it is wandering around killing bugs, or repeating the same Shadow Beast fight over and over and over again. It's baffling that for how fleshed out the swordplay is in Twilight Princess, combat as Wolf Link is utterly brain dead. Nearly every Shadow Beast encounter is a recycle of the exact same process, and it stops being challenging or interesting after the second or third time. Wolf Link was a huge wasted opportunity, and I actively dread having to play through his segments. I've always been sort of baffled at the idea that Ganondorf's reveal is this huge, well-hidden twist. Maybe if you're an actual child when you play through the game for the first time, but I saw it coming miles away, and I'm not a particularly astute person. I disagree with the idea that Twilight Princess has a better story as well. It certainly has more going on, but more isn't better. Twilight Princess has so many different moving parts and nouns you need to remember that it at times begins to feel like a badly adapted shonen anime. Twilight Princess is simply a bloated narrative. It moves from plot element to plot element, and when it finishes with them, it discards them completely. The Orden kids are saved and then are never really meaningful again. The light spirits are introduced and then discarded, save I suppose for a one-off line when the light arrows are created. The people you meet in the various towns are assisted and then never come up again. The story hops from plot thread to plot thread and has very little cohesion. It's like a roller coaster. Fun to experience, but ultimately pretty shallow. Wind Waker, on the other hand, is the opposite. Just about every character you meet stays relevant through the entire story. Your sister is the impetus for the quest, and even after you save her, she remains relevant by staying with the pirate crew, who themselves are a fixture in the game from the opening to the close. The King of Red Lions not only sticks with you through the game, but has a direct impact on the climax. Even minor characters like Quill, Komali, Medley, and Makar are actually recurring, being involved even in the ending. I think Medley probably gets more screen time in Wind Waker than Princess Zelda does in Twilight Princess. Not to mention that Valu, basically the equivalent of a light spirit, is an active part of the story as opposed to being visited and then discarded in the way that the light spirits were. Twilight Princess has a couple of excellent characters and storylines and dozens of underwritten ones, and it deals with those ones by linearly blazing past them. Wind Waker definitely has a smaller scope, but that pays off in a well-rounded narrative. Wind Waker has a set of characters that are memorable because they are returned to so many times throughout the game, and given chances to have their own little character arcs. And this isn't even getting into the fact that both Ganondorf and Zelda has superior portrayals in Wind Waker. Twilight Princess Zelda is basically a nothing character, and Wind Waker Ganondorf is routinely cited as the most fleshed out sympathetic version of the character. Before I pass it back to you, I want to return to the topic of dungeons just one last time, because I actually don't think that Wind Waker has bad dungeons. Sure, they're simple, no doubt about it, but I'm not convinced that a simple dungeon is bad. The Shadow Temple in Ocarina is easy, there's just about no thought needed in actually advancing through it, but it's probably the most memorable dungeon in the game regardless. People don't think about how easy the Shadow Temple is, they think about how atmospheric it is, how well designed it is visually, how it efficiently creates feelings of dread, how spooky the music is, how interesting the relation to the Sheikah is. The Shadow Temple is not a bad dungeon because it's simple, and it's my opinion that Wind Waker dungeons are actually great in the same way that the Shadow Temple is. Dragon Roost Island is visually stunning. I don't think even you can deny that. Sailing towards a massive volcano with a dragon atop it and knowing that this is the dungeon you'll be climbing is a wicked feeling. The lava looks so nice and they nailed the atmosphere. It feels like it's hot in there just by looking at the inside. And from a lore perspective, the dungeon is great too. You're told that the Dragon Roost Temple is basically ritual grounds that the Rito journey through to get their scale, and this is grounded through the placement of numerous areas that are obviously meant for the Rito to rest along the way. Once Ganon's enemies are removed from the scene, you can easily visualize Komali scaling the dungeon to get his scale from Valu at the top. The Forbidden Woods dungeon is the exact same way. You can get the vibe of what the dungeon will be like just by sailing towards it. And with the lush green and vivid splashes of color throughout the dungeon, it's an enjoyable romp through as well. The same applies for the Tower of the Gods and the Earth Temple, both being well justified in the lore as well as visually interesting and enjoyable to traverse. The Wind Temple pretty much just sucks, but hey, every Zelda game has a stinker of a temple. Wolf Link is a massive waste of time, Twilight Princess's impressive larger story is mostly bloat, and the only character that's actually better is Midna. Wind Waker has a tighter narrative that is far better fleshed out, and it has more than a single memorable character. There's a reason that Toon Link became a Zelda icon, whereas Twilight Princess Link pretty much just gets attention on Tumblr. Take your last turn, traitor.
Whereas the hero of Twilight is a Tumblr icon, the hero of Wind simply doesn't have the design to be. First, I'll clap back at the point that you made of the characters. You're completely right when it comes to Medley having more screen time than Zelda and Twilight Princess. But why compare Medley to Zelda when we could compare the Princess of Twilight, Midna? Or maybe even King Bulblin, a long-standing character whose lore dates back to the involvement with the Ordonian children. Showing an element of those characters are present even in the ending stages of the game. You tell of Ganondorf being fleshed out at having the backstory he does, with a crazed laugh leading to his death, but I must interfere with this point and also say that Zant, the initial primary antagonist of Twilight Princess, has a very similar backstory. Once cast out within the Twilight, then being given a greater power and having a greater reasoning to live. And while Ganondorf in Wind Waker has his own crazy laugh, Zant has a crazy manipulative fighting style that shows his own personality. Not to mention his overall weirdness that I'm sure every single Zelda fan could probably get behind. And I think that the fact that the hero of Twilight is virtually alone for the entirety of the game just shows how badass he is. Showing that just him, the Master Sword and Midna can destroy both the Usurper King and the Demon King Ganon, along with his human form Ganondorf, a possessed Zelda, and all of the dodgy bosses that they vanquish over the course of their journey. I mean, I wouldn't go anywhere near Omagoma, and I'd hope you wouldn't either. The character arcs that are seen within Twilight Princess are far superior to Wind Waker's character arcs in my opinion, but Nehru, I'll leave that up to your opinion as I don't think we could agree on that even if we were to have a full conversation about it. Dungeons wise, I'll have to stay civil with you as you make a very good point that dungeons don't have to be difficult to stumble your way through, and especially your Shadow Temple point shielded your point as most would agree is by far the most memorable temple in Ocarina of Time. Though again, if we're giving our opinions, I think that the Forbidden Woods wasn't an amazing embodiment of atmosphere in a Zelda game. Yeah, I do think that the dungeons in Wind Waker, for the most part, are simplistic and atmospheric. Yeah, I find myself thinking that the atmosphere in some of Twilight Princess's dungeons are far superior, even if not simplistic. As already mentioned, a couple of great examples would be the Arbiter's Grounds and Snow Peak Ruins, or even the serene atmosphere present in the city in the sky. As I did with the last point, I'll happily put this dungeon debate to rest as I feel like everybody has their different expectations for their Zelda dungeons, and most of us won't change those preset opinions. This actually leads quite nicely into my penultimate argument. I seem to enjoy Twilight Princess's bosses a vast amount more than I do in Wind Waker, though admittedly I would say that the Puppet Ganon and Final Ganon showdown were among my top 10 moments in Zelda history. However, I feel like the bosses in the rest of the game pale in comparison. Let me give you some examples. The Goma found in Dragon Roost, which is basically just grappling onto Valu, who just happens to be the equivalent of a swing set for Toon Link to play on, though this is the first boss, so it can be forgiven I guess. Kele Demos in the Forbidden Woods, which happens to be a copy-paste of Baronade from Ocarina of Time, albeit slightly improved. Godan in the Tower of Gods, who again happens to be a copy-paste of Bongo Bongo from Ocarina of Time. the Helm Rock King, which in hindsight is similar in many ways to that of the Volvagia fight in Ocarina of Time as well. Malgira is actually decent, so I'll have to give Wind Waker that one. The less said about Jalhalla found within the Earth Temple, probably the better. By the way, I am in no way trying to say that all of the bosses in Twilight Princess are masterpieces. Far from it. For example, I'll happily take Morpheal and add them to a worst bosses in Zelda list. Like, I'm not sure if it can even hurt Link, but most bosses in Twilight Princess are either just straight up epic or have a larger purpose. Again, let me cycle through some. Diababa in the Forest Temple was a somewhat new concept and was explored to a decent standard. Fyrus in the Goron Mines being not an amazing boss fight, but as stated, this was the chief of the Gorons, showing a bit more lore to us. Maybe not even enough to fill a page of Hyrule Historia, but still a slither of lore. Morpheal is ginormous, but overall is a ginormous flop. Star-Lord uses a new item first present in Twilight Princess and widely develops on it, and shows its full capabilities. This is one of many reasons why it's widely regarded as one of the best boss fights in the series. Blitzetta in Snowpeak Ruins obviously shows lore in terms of Yuto and Yuta, and also uses another new item shown in Twilight Princess, the Ball and Chain. Armagoma brings a new twist on the Goma boss that most fans will love at this point. Argorok cleverly uses the claw shots and incorporates rather stunning gameplay elements to genuinely bring together an interesting boss fight that fits snug with the temple's theme of the sky. Next we come to the final bosses, and they aren't anything to write home about, except for lore matters, especially when talking about Xant's fighting style and revelation of Ganondorf's presence after the ordeal, and the final Ganondorf fight giving us a satisfying end to the story, with him finally dying, which has only been seen in a few games, including the Wind Waker. I think that when comparing bosses, it's a no-brainer. As I come to a close on my final arguments regarding these two games, I'd like to visit the game's overall atmosphere. Personally, I much prefer a darker atmosphere in my Zelda games. As I said, I love Wind Waker, and I think that they nailed the bright, happy atmosphere that I think the Zelda team were quite clearly striving for. But when talking on personal preferences, I think that the dark feel of the darker Zelda games, namely Twilight Princess and Majora's Mask, are a nice change to the series every now and then. And it seems we might even be getting a similar treatment for Breath of the Wild 2. My point for this section is a simple one. Nehru. I'm going to change this entire video up right now, and I'm going to ask you a question. What's your preference on your Zelda games, man? Do you prefer the darker or lighter tones of the game? It's time for the last opinion on these matters.
Me? Gungaga.
You say the Hero of Winds doesn't have the design to be an icon, but I mean, his design was strong enough to start a series of DS games, and even Minish Cap iterated on its design. You're allowed to be wrong, but I think that his design being carried forward in the series directly trumps a bunch of thirsty Tumblr fangirls. I apologize to any thirsty fangirls watching. Don't worry, I thirst for Goose. I was comparing Medley to Zelda to make a point, that even a side character in Wind Waker is better fleshed out than one of Twilight Princess's main characters. And I'm not going to compare Medley to Midna, though Medley definitely has a longer and better storyline than King Bulbin. His character growth is what, a single scene? I will happily compare Tetra to any of the Twilight Princess characters though. She goes through some sort of growth or development in just about every scene she's in. She starts off so cocky and selfish that she has to be forced to say thank you to Link, and she ends up being willing to lay her life for Link and Hyrule. You know, that reminds me of another companion. Almost like that other companion isn't actually as unique as people say she is, and is just an iteration on Tetra's personality. Nah, I must be imagining things. I don't have any strong feelings towards Ganondorf's crazed laugh in Wind Waker, as you put it. In fact, it's his lack of craziness that people enjoy so much. He has a sympathetic reason for wanting to conquer Hyrule. Don't you remember this quote?
My country lay within a vast desert. When the sun rose into the sky, a burning wind punished my lands, searing the world. And when the moon climbed into the dark of night, a frigid gale pierced our homes. No matter when it came, the wind carried the same thing: death. But the winds that blew across the green fields of Hyrule brought something other than suffering and ruin. I coveted that wind, I suppose.
There's nothing maniacal about that. He's just a king that wanted to help his people and took it too far. Zant is pretty decent, I suppose, but truthfully, the subordinate being manipulated by his master who turns heel at the last second trope is hardly a cutting-edge narrative technique. Overall, I think that Midna does have a better character arc than anybody in Wind Waker, though I think Tetra comes close. And I don't think Midna is a wholly original character arc. But honestly, Midna's literally it. Everybody else in Twilight Princess either has their storyline discarded right after it's introduced, or just has a better version in Wind Waker. And I'll take an entire cast of well-developed characters over a cast where one character excels and the rest are flat. Devaluing the bosses in Wind Waker because they're based off previous bosses seems bizarre, seeing as Phyrus, Argarok, Armagoma, and Morpheal all resort to the same shoot the glowy spot strategy as dozens of other Zelda bosses. Diababa is barely a boss, more of a moving target, and Blizetta's chip away at armor mechanic has been redone many times since A Link to the Past. When people say that Twilight Princess has amazing dungeon bosses, I think they're just thinking of Star-Lord and willfully misremembering the rest of them. Wind Waker's bosses aren't incredible by any means, but they aren't any worse than Twilight Princess's. Star-Lord is an incredibly cool boss to be sure, but I'd argue that Puppet Ganon is just as memorable, and even to a lesser extent Mulgara. Both games end with Ganondorf getting viciously killed, and while Xant's neck snap is memorable and surprising, I think I can say that this scene right here will never be topped. The atmosphere thing I think is a moot point. Both games do an incredible job of establishing their atmosphere. I would say that I think Wind Waker's atmosphere has more of a direct influence on the game though. Twilight Princess is a wonderful game, don't get me wrong, but it's not the best GameCube Zelda, that's Wind Waker. The story is better, the characters are better overall, the graphics have aged far better than Twilight Princess's have, the main gimmick is better, its famously tedious quest is less tedious, and Wind Waker Link is still being put on merchandise and included in games to this day, whereas Twilight Princess Link has been wholly replaced by our beloved blue boy. I'm sorry Triforce Trends, but it makes sense why you'd like Twilight Princess so much. After all, that game's influence on the series was just a passing trend.
Nehru, it's been a great debate, and whilst I still stick by my points, I'll happily accept you had some excellent points as well. Thank you so much for inviting me on the channel, I've loved every second, even if we did get to rant about the Twilight series at one stage. For anyone who's interested, I create weekly Zelda or general Nintendo related videos, but Zelda deep down is my real passion. Please subscribe if you're interested in the absolute slightest, as it would really help me out. And of course, please do like this video and subscribe to Nehru, as this video would not have happened without him hunting down my channel. Once again, thanks man.
It was a delight to have you on, Triforce Trends. If you guys do head over to his channel, I recommend his video on 3 mini theories. You can find a link in the description. Thanks for taking the time, Trends. You guys know what to do. If you think Triforce Trends won and Twilight Princess is the better game, include Trends won in your comment. If you think I was right and Wind Waker reigns supreme, put Nehru won. And base it off the merits of our arguments, not necessarily your own opinion. Thanks for watching, like and sub if you haven't, and as always, stay safe out there. It's dangerous to go alone.